Oh, Betty Sue. Did caucus run late? Joe, did caucus just end? No. Okay, good. I'm gonna say, wow. Hey, Betty. Thanks for joining us, Betty. Yeah, I came into the back. How's everyone doing? Good. We ready? Okay. Good morning. Javier Becerra, Chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, joined by our Vice Chairman, Joe Crowley, and also pleased to be joined by our colleague from Minnesota, Betty McCollum, who serves on the Appropriations Subcommittee and also on the Defense Subcommittee, which is very important these days. Lots of activity relating to the appropriations bills, the continuing resolution, and we've asked Congresswoman McCollum to join us based on that expertise. Good caucus meeting. Everyone's still trying to figure out if we will have at least a short-term budget in place. It's unfortunate that for the last several years, we're not talking about a real budget. We're talking about these itsy-bitsy budgets, these piecemeal budgets that prevent our federal government from shutting down, as we saw a few years back when Republicans were having this internal fight and couldn't agree, and as a result, Congress didn't pass a budget, and most of the federal agencies had to shut down until we piecemeal started to bring them back up. 9 days away from seeing our Republican colleagues once again, as they control the Congress, bring our government to a halt. Meanwhile, Americans continue to become infected with the Zika virus, especially in states like Florida. I believe the number is now over 20,000 U.S. citizens who have contracted the Zika virus. We know that some 1,700 women who are pregnant have contracted the Zika virus. We know the consequences. We've been told by the heads of the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention programs that it could cost us certainly the life of a child born as a result of a Zika infection by the mother, pregnant mother. It can be bad enough, if not life-threatening. But if that child survives, it could end up costing us somewhere around $10 million over the life of that child to provide healthcare services to someone who has abnormalities or impacts, health impacts as a result of the Zika virus invading the woman's pregnant body. 200 children born as a result of a Zika-infected pregnant mother, costing us $10 million, would total the same amount of money that the President and the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health healthcare experts requested to prevent Americans from ever getting infected by the Zika virus. Let me repeat that. What I call the generals of healthcare, the experts on healthcare, have requested to tackle the Zika virus, $1.9 billion, is equal to the cost of providing the $10 million of healthcare for a child born as a result of a Zika-infected pregnant woman. 200. We know already that 1,600 or more American women, U.S. citizen women, have contracted the Zika virus. This is what happens when you don't provide the resources that our generals on healthcare tell us we need. And yet, 9 days away from a government shutdown, without yet monies as we know we need for the Zika virus to fight it, as the CDC director has said, the cupboard is bare when it comes to resources for Zika. 9 days out, and right now, what are we doing on the floor of the House? In Congress, we're talking about things like impeaching the commissioner of the IRS, engaging in an impeachment proceeding that has never happened before. The only folks that in the more than 200 years of our history the Congress has tried to impeach are either the president and, in one sole case, a cabinet member, but never a administration official below cabinet have we seen Congress try to move forward on impeachment. And yet that's what we're spending our time dealing with. Have we done anything on gun violence prevention? No. Have we done anything to help the 100,000 residents of Flint, Michigan, who for the longest time were drinking lead-contaminated water? No. Have we done anything to help deal with the opioid epidemic in this country? No. It's time for us to act. We shouldn't wait till the last moment. We shouldn't wait till the cliff is upon us and wait till we fall over it. It's time to get the work of the American people done. We urge our colleagues on the Republican side to come to terms on a budget. We shouldn't do these piecemeal budgets, but we should do it the right way. With that, let me yield to our Vice Chairman, Joe Crowley.
Thank you, Chairman, and it's good to be joined by Betty McCollum this morning. I look forward to hearing from her momentarily. Let me first and foremost start off by saying thank you to law enforcement, first responders, the intelligence community in New York City, in the tri-state region, and throughout our country, and quite frankly, throughout the world. It was remarkable how quickly those who were responsible for the bombing incident in Manhattan were tracked down, were apprehended. And we ask New Yorkers and Americans to continue to be vigilant as to whether or not we have all of them at this point. We don't know. But I want to congratulate both the big departments like New York City and the small departments that, like the one in New Jersey that captured one of the assailants and the ringleader that we believe was the ringleader of this particular incident. New York is a tough town. We've been through an awful lot. September is a month that reminds us often the price that we paid for our freedom in New York and here as America, and here in America and as Americans. That it's something we have to be ever vigilant about. But I do believe our law enforcement deserves incredible credit for the way in which they reacted to this particular incident of terrorism in New York City. I also want to concur with my colleague, my friend, and the chair of the Democratic Caucus in his remarks about the way in which Republicans have approached doing their job, and in this case, really not doing their job. He talked about the issues that they seem to have a penchant to focusing on, some of which, quite frankly, could wait till next year. If they really want to go after Mr. Koskinen, they could wait until after this month. If they really want to bring sanctions against Democrats and the Democratic Caucus for the action we took in the sit-in, they could wait. But that seems to be the focus of what they want to talk about while they're here in Washington, when there is a fiscal cliff looming once again for the American people. Their budget will run out in 9 days, and our Republican colleagues with such difficult issues ahead of our country, whether it's Louisiana and the flooding in the southern part of our country, whether it's the issue of the Zika virus, the opioid issue in our country, those who are addicted to this, and we see it rampant in every quarter of our nation. That problem is running rampant. It's the issue of water in Flint, Michigan. I've often said what we do the least amongst us is a reflection of the values of our nation. And I really don't believe it's a value of our nation to do nothing about the people in Flint, Michigan, especially the children, those who have no voice or have no vote. It's a reflection upon us, though, how we treat the victims of flooding in the southern part of our nation, particularly in Louisiana. If we don't help these folks, I hope that's not the reflection upon we as a country, as Americans. Not properly addressing, I think, as the chairman said so eloquently, listening to the generals, listening to the experts as to what we need to tackle and attack the issue of the Zika virus and its spread here in the United States. And as tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people suffer from addiction to prescription medicine and then to heroin, it's a real crisis in our nation. A generation is being lost because we're not acting quickly enough to address these issues in a wide-scale way. There's enough going on in terms of natural disasters, as I said before, and man-made disasters. The Republican Congress continues to create additional stress on the American people, questioning whether or not their government will continue to operate. We just simply have to stop this and do the job that we were sent here to do. The Republicans need to do their job, and that is pass these spending bills and give the American people the confidence that they deserve in their government. And with that, I'll turn it back to the chairman for an introduction.
Our colleague, thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Our colleague Betty McCollum has sat on the committee that knows about budgets and how to make our agencies work. She also comes from a state which this past weekend also experienced an attack where there were several people who were injured, and so we're pleased to have Betty McCollum with us today. Betty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Vice Chairman Crawley. First off, as a Minnesotan, I want to be perfectly clear. The attack in St. Cloud, Minnesota was a vicious attack. It was terrorism, likely done by a lone wolf. And we are thankful that none of the victims lost their lives. But it was an act in which terrified the people in the mall and brought great pause and concern to people in Minnesota and throughout the United States. I, along with Mr. Crawley, would like to reflect for a moment on an off-duty police officer who rose up to the call and quickly took control of the situation so that it didn't spin any farther out of control. Back home, President Obama's been in touch with Governor Dayton, and we know that the FBI will conduct a full and complete investigation. Minnesotans still have many questions, and they deserve to be answered. I also want to state very clearly that I am so proud to represent Minnesota, a state in where all races, faiths, political affiliations stood united in rejecting all forms of violence, extremism, and hate. There was a vigil last night in St. Cloud where people from all over the state of Minnesota and from the area in the St. Cloud region came together and expressed solidarity of getting the answers and moving forward. But most importantly, they stood in solidarity with our Muslim communities, not only in Minnesota but across the country. We know how important and what a critical asset in countering extreme terrorism that these communities have been in wanting to get the answers themselves and stop the extreme violence that has happened. But Donald Trump's attacks on our Muslim American friends, neighbors, and co-workers undermine those efforts to keep America safe. But as my colleagues were pointing out, we have work here to do in Congress, and this work also reflects the work that Mr. Crowley and I need to have the FBI to have all the tools in the toolbox to move forward on. This Congress has failed to do its job and has failed to pass appropriation bills on the House floor on time. These Republican games, and that's what they are, folks, they're election games, they just need to stop. We need to pass a budget, we need to pass these bills, and we need to stop playing partisan politics with our national security. Americans need to know that they're going to be kept safe by the people who wear a uniform, whether it is police, military, whether it is someone who's working on the lines of collecting intelligence. And we just need to make sure that a budget is passed on time so cities, counties, state, and yes, our military and homeland security know that they have the dollars to plan, the resources to move forward. I can't say this enough as a member of the Defense Appropriations Committee. I know that we face serious national security challenges around the globe. We've got ISIL, North Korea, Russia, and the Chinese expansion in the South Island Seas. Folks, we need to get serious about getting these budgets and bills passed on time so that our intelligence community, our defense community, and those who work at Homeland Security here at home have the tools and they can make the plans to keep America safe. I know that my Democratic colleagues stand ready to make these investments in national security, homeland security, and the intelligence necessary to keep America safe. I call upon my Republican colleagues to walk across the aisle, not just reach, walk across the aisle and work with us on this. Working together, we can get it done. Their conference needs to resolve its own internal differences so that the American public knows the Congress will work for them and keep them safe.
Betty, thank you. We'll take any questions. Yeah.
What's your impression of the likelihood that a stopgap bill will include disaster relief accompanied by Flint assistance?
So I believe Democrats have said very early on and pretty consistently that we shouldn't be playing games with the budget because the lives of so many people are impacted when politics interferes with getting a budget in place. People depend on their services, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, or our troops getting paid for their service, or FBI doing the investigations. We really can't afford to have our men and women who serve us in all sorts of uniforms stop coming to work because Congress plays political games with the budget and can't pass one. And that's where we are 9 days from that date. At the same time, Zika funding, that's not something you sort of just say, well, whenever we can do it, we should do it. Talk to the American women who are pregnant who now have Zika and ask them when they wish that Congress would have provided the resources to combat Zika. That was yesterday. And so there are emergency situations that are caused through no fault of anyone's that we should take action on. So whether it's Zika or trying to help the flood victims in Louisiana, we should be acting on an emergency basis. So I think Democrats would be willing to see a provision like Zika funding and Louisiana emergency relief attached to a budget bill, so long as, again, they don't play games with it and start tinkering with it in political fashion. It's a clean bill. That's why we say clean bill. A clean budget bill, a clean Zika bill, a clean emergency, the natural disaster funding bill, emergency funding for Flint, but clean. We don't want to see all sorts of riders attached that have nothing to do with the legislation. Let me let my colleagues respond.
I would only add to that, I believe it was 13 people whose lives were lost in the flooding in the southern states, in Louisiana. 30,000 people's lives were saved. That's how destructive this particular flooding was. The level of rain was enormous, and not just in the low-lying areas. It was brought to my attention this morning that homes that are 28 feet above sea level were also inundated by flooding, well above the floodplain. So we know that tens of thousands of people were affected by the flooding. We know that tens of thousands of people, particularly children in Flint, Michigan, have, for over a year now, a year has gone by since this was discovered, but more than a year has gone by since these people have been exposed, these children have been exposed to the elements of lead in their drinking water. And their federal government has done very little, if anything at all, to help fix the problem. And I think there's going to be a lot of answering in the future to be done by the Republican leadership of the House. Is what did you do? When did you do it? Whether it's on the issue of Zika, as the chairman has mentioned, women who have Zika today, they almost don't even care what you do at this point. They already have it. Why didn't you take care of it earlier? Why didn't you do something earlier so that I didn't get this? Why did you fiddle around and do nothing while I got this? Or, you know, the child who will suffer through elementary school and through high school and the rest of their life because the federal government didn't step in to ensure safe drinking water for their community. The Republican Congress has to come to a decision. Do they or do they not have the back of the American people? Because what you do or don't do for these regions and for the folks in Flint or people in Florida and elsewhere with Zika, or the people in the southern part of our nation who had tremendous flooding, what you don't do for them, they have to question whether you'll ever do anything for them if they find themselves in a difficult position. That's the question the Republicans have to ask themselves. Do they have the back of the American people? So far, at least for the people of Flint, for well over a year, they haven't had that back. I suspect if something is done, it's not going to be because they want to do it. It's because we forced their hand in having to do it, and that's what I would like to see our caucus continue to hold to.
Will Democrats demand disaster relief, including Flint? Or
We have been.
are you
We have been.
addressing this in the late
We have been. I listen, personally speaking, I think we've waited too long.
I mean, all this stuff.
The Republicans have been lame for over a year on this issue. They have been lame. Waiting for a lame duck, again, is months. That is unnecessary. We know what the problem is. We know what some of the costs are. We should appropriate the appropriate amount to help these folks get back on their feet and ensure that their children have safe drinking water. It's not that simple. It's a complicated problem in terms of fixing it. It's going to take time, but we have to take the first steps and help the state of Michigan, help the local government do that as well. I think it's a responsibility of our country to do that.
Betty, did you want to add anything?
Well, you know, just think as a mom or a dad. You tell your child in Flint, Michigan, you can't turn on the tap to brush their teeth before they go to bed at night. They can't drink. They just can't get up in the middle of the night and turn on a tap safely like children we expect to be able to do all across the United States. To your point, are we holding firm on it? Absolutely, we're holding firm on it as Democrats, and so are our colleagues in the Senate. And I, off the record, have many, many conversations with Republicans who know it's the right thing to do, and they know that they need to do it, but it's within their own internal politics that they are holding up what the majority of Americans have repeatedly asked us to do. Fix problems, get the economy back on track, do your job. It's that simple. We're in the minority. We're going to keep their feet to the fire on this, but I think come election day, people are going to be judged as to whether or not they stood up and got their job done. And what both my colleagues said, how we treat someone in the time of disaster is how we should expect to be treated in a time of disaster. Democrats stand up. If someone has a car accident, you call 911, you get out, and you take a look at the car, and you see what you can do to help. You don't just sit there and wait for someone else to make the phone call and someone else to maybe check and see what's going on. That's not the American way of doing things, and I think voters are going to hold us accountable for getting our job done. We're ready to do it.
I wanted to ask all of you, in particular Mr. Crowell, since you're a New Yorker, about this potential override of the 9/11 lawsuit bill that should be coming up in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, there are members who oppose this bill. It was approved by unanimous consent of both bodies. Do you sense that some members, might be kind of nudged into voting for the override because we're going to be on the record now? And this is, even if there are legitimate reasons, concerns about lawsuits or sovereignty, then it's, quote, bad politics for them to be perceived, as you say, in the month of September, against a bill to help 9/11 families.
Well, I do recognize the timing of this bill, which is interesting of itself. But having said that, I do think there are legitimate issues of concern, and that is whether or not justice is being made available to the victims of what happened on 9/11. My city, but our country overall, suffered tremendously because of that attack. Many lives were not just disrupted, they were destroyed. And I believe in justice. I believe in finding answers as well as to who was responsible for that. I also recognize the President of the United States has a much bigger picture he's looking at as well. And I intend to look at his veto message. But I would suggest, I think many New Yorkers and many Americans are very concerned about finding justice. Justice for the victims and for their families is important to us.
Do you think, as someone who is from New York City and knows and has probably worked very closely with these families for the past 15 years, do you think that the politics of this are so muddled that if anybody does have those legitimate concerns about sovereignty and some of the issues we saw from the former ambassador, the former director of the CIA yesterday, that they just say, look, we're going to be cowed into this because I can't be on the record as being perceived against being against the 9/11?
I think we all have to look at this and come to what we are comfortable in supporting or not supporting. I think everyone can look at this and maybe possibly question the timing of the resolution or the legislation that was brought before us here in the month of September when commemorating the 15th anniversary of the events of 9/11 and how that has impacted the psyche of America. So I would note that. At the same time, for those of us who have been very close to the victims and understand their plight, who are looking for answers, who are looking for what actually caused this event, was there any, and look, at the end of the day, why I support the legislation, have supported the legislation is I believe that justice is paramount, and having opportunity to find the truth is paramount, wherever that may lead. And that's why I supported the bill.
Other questions? Yeah.
So some Republicans in the Senate have alleged that Democrats have pulled things up to prevent Republicans from going for the candidate. I was wondering what there's any thoughts to that. I was also wondering if you had any plans to kind of push Republicans to act on both.
So let me make sure I understand. 9 days from shutting down government, Republicans who control the Senate and the House are saying Democrats are the ones that are trying to hold up a solution so that Republicans can't go home to campaign. I agree that Republicans need to go home and campaign. There's no doubt that they're in trouble. But it's hard for the majority that controls both the House and the Senate to lay blame on the minority party, which doesn't control the operations of the Congress. They've had 9 months to come up with a budget. They haven't. They've had almost 12 months, that's about 10, 11 months, to just follow the agreement that was reached last December, so we wouldn't have this kind of a budget fiasco. But Republicans internally, as Betty McCollum mentioned, are in this internal fight amongst themselves. Republicans have only themselves to blame. They won the majority. They control both chambers in the Congress. If we shut down government, it's their fault. If we come close to it, or even closer than we are today, it's because the majority hasn't yet come to terms with what it must do. Democrats have said very clearly, we'll stick to the terms of last year's budget agreement for this year. And we're willing and will fight for the emergency funding for those disasters, natural disasters, that where Americans need help. What we will not support is Republicans trying to tack on things to these must-pass bills that have nothing to do with them and have a lot to do with their internal social political agenda. And so Democrats, as Betty McCollum said, we're ready. But it's not up to us. It's Republicans who have the mantle of control, and they should be running this place.
Can I just maybe get a point of clarification? This question comes after we had the longest break in memory during the months of July and August and September. Is that correct? I think we don't set the schedule. We're in the minority in either the House or the Senate. The Republican majority sets the schedule. The deadline that is before us was not something that we, the minority, set. It's something the majority of both houses set and agreed to. To somehow, it's almost, I don't mean this towards you, it's almost ludicrous to suggest that we somehow could command that we stay here if the Republicans were to leave. It just simply doesn't work that way. We'd like to think we can stay here and do the people's business. We'd like to stay here and do the job that the American people sent us here to do. It's about time the Republicans themselves stayed here to do the job they were sent here to do and stop worrying just about getting reelected. That seems to be what this is all about. That somehow we're trying to stop them from going home so they can't get reelected. If they do their job and they do it well, the American people will reward them for it. And if not, they won't.
Betty, did you want to add in here?
Well, you asked a question on gun control. And so the whole issue about not being able to set the agenda, not being able to bring bills to the floor was the reason why we stayed on the floor and we talked about the lack of moving forward on the gun control issues. You know, simple things like fly, no buy. American public are there. I've had numerous of people in St. Paul. I attended an event that was put together by some organizations that really would like to see us do some common sense gun safety reform. And so when we had the opportunity to be on the floor and say that we were ready to stay and work, our reward by our colleagues was ethics charges. But we're ready to stay here. We're ready to work.
Assuming we get a CR, what do you think the chances are in December that we see an omnibus that funds most federal agencies? Or are we going to see a lot of federal agencies, a lot of non-defense agencies just get level funded, through all of next year?
Well, that question really goes to the gaming that's occurring here. By not doing a full-blown budget for the year, for the fiscal year, it gives Republicans another bite at the apple to cause mischief with agencies they're not the most happy with. We talked about how the IRS commissioner is facing potential impeachment because some Republicans are unhappy with him. They're using government as if it were their toy to play with, and it's unfortunate because some people do hard work, and the IRS commissioner will tell you he's got a tough job. Our hope is that when we come back in December, if we get this short-term budget agreement to keep us government running until December, that we'll then complete the whole task of finishing the fiscal year budget instead of doing little bites at the apple where it lets Republicans take other bites in places they shouldn't. And so we'll see, but no doubt there are some who would like to play this game on and on and on and be disruptive of the way our government should function. But that's, again, really up in the hands of the majorities in the Senate and the House, Republican controlled. And we'll see what they want to do, if they want to do it seriously and finish the budget, or if they want to play games. Here and then here.
Yesterday, Congressman Amash, basically forced a roll call vote and a number of suspensions. What do you make of this kind of internal divide within the Republicans, maybe three ways between the House Freedom Caucus, one part of the House Freedom Caucus, and the Republican?
Want to start it off?
Well, this has been going on for quite some time. It may have just manifested itself in some procedural motions yesterday and possibly this week. It's really, I think we have a better understanding of what John Boehner was dealing with, and I think that's what Paul Ryan is now coming to terms with as well. Just how difficult it is to have any sense of comedy within their own caucus. It's becoming more and more apparent, I think, to the American people as well when you see that taking place. Look, I'd like to say I understand exactly what's in the minds of the Tea Party members of the House. I don't dare to go there at this point, especially for one apparently who lost his primary and is still will not be coming back here next year, is taking some of this action as well. I don't know what to make of any of that.
Betty, did you want to comment? I have to comment because
I can't get in their mind.
yeah,
I can't.
that's a perfect question to respond to because it goes exactly to the point of why we're 9 days away from watching Republicans threaten to shut down our government. It's not that Democrats are trying to keep Republicans here from going home to campaign. It's not that it's such a tough issue. We know what the budget would look like. Last December, we came up with an agreement on what the caps would be on how much the budget would have for resources. All that's been answered. The difficulty is what you just point out. There's a core group of Republicans, principally in the House, who are willing to disrupt everything, including the operation of government, to the point of shutting it down, to the point of causing chaos yesterday on the floor of the House for their own Republican leadership. And so until the internal civil war among Republicans is resolved, we'll probably continue to see this. The difficulty is this has an impact on everyone. How Republican leadership brings together those colleagues on the Republican side so we can actually work together, unclear, but it must feel like trying to herd cats. Mike, I think you.
But they might want to avoid a sit-in, apparently.
Yeah.
So.
Mike, I think you have the last word or last question.
Just a quick follow-up on Chad's question, and especially for Mr. Crowley. You know, if Obama vetoes this bill, the Saudi 9/11 bill, what Donald Trump and the Republicans are going to say. They're going to say, here's this Democratic president denying justice for the 9/11 families. He's siding with Middle Eastern oligarchs over the people in New York and Washington, D.C. With that in mind, and considering that you appear to have plenty of support to override the veto, there's going to be a futile effort anyways. Is there any kind of push from the Capitol? Senator Blumenthal mentioned this yesterday. Don't veto it at all. Just get on board, and then we don't have to play the political game with this, which might hurt us as a whole.
So I'll yield in a moment to the vice chairman, but this is one of those issues where you have to do what your conscience tells you best. The president is correct in saying that if we open the door for American citizens to be suing foreign governments or state governments, it opens the door for those foreign governments to start allowing their citizens to sue us, our government, in their courts. And I would rather be in our courts than the courts of a lot of other countries, because I can at least feel more comfortable of securing a just hearing and result in our courts than I can in a lot of other countries. That's the concern of the president. That's always been the concern. That's why sovereign immunity has always been provided to national governments. And we respect it, even though sometimes we know some of these countries have governments and courts that really don't offer real justice to their people. Having said that, if there's evidence that there was state involvement in the 9/11 attacks, then our people have a right to go before a court. We're not giving them the right to take arms and go, attack people where we think the planning for this 9/11 attack may occur. We're just simply saying, if there's evidence that the victims and families can prove that there was a state or government involvement in those attacks, then by God, give them a chance to show that in our court of law. And so I think that's why many of us are prepared to vote for it, understanding that the sovereign immunity principle, which could impact us in the future, could have some results that we don't like in the future. But right now, I think some of us feel very comfortable providing that narrow limitation to allow American families and victims from 9/11 to have their day in court.
I would only add, because I have to do MSNBC momentarily, and I'm not running out of here for any other reason. Don't you think that I concur with everything the chairman has just said? I would just suggest that I'm empathetic to the president's situation in terms of diplomatic immunity. But I think the merits will have to speak for themselves here. This was one of the most blackened days in the history of our country, one of the darkest days. And there are a lot of still questions that are unanswered for many of the American people and for the victims' families. And for the victims themselves. They're not here to ask those questions. It'll have to be based on the merit of the case, and the courts will have to make that decision. And I'm comfortable with that. As I said, I will read if the president does veto, I will read that message, and we'll take it from there.
But there are no conversations from you with the White House?
I think the White House. I think the White House knows exactly where we all are.
Thanks a lot.